Hello, lovely souls. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you right now? Drop your city and the time of day in the comments below. Whether you're wrapped in blankets in Manchester at midnight, driving through quiet streets in Toronto at dusk, or stealing a moment of peace in Mumbai before dawn, this story is for you. Tonight's story is about a princess who became a payment, and a duke who learned that the most dangerous thing a man can do is underestimate a woman who has already lost everything. They called him the Iron Duke, not for the color of his estates, nor the strength of his armies, but for the coldness that lived in his chest where a heart should have been. Sebastian Blackthorne, 6th Duke of Thornfield, was a man sculpted from winter itself. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes the shade of frozen steel, and a reputation that made grown men step aside when he passed. He had built an empire on the bones of his enemies, amassed a fortune that could purchase kingdoms, and cultivated a loneliness so profound that even his own servants whispered prayers before entering his presence. They said he felt nothing, that grief had carved out his insides and left only ice. They said he collected beautiful things the way other men collected debts, with cold precision and no sentiment whatsoever. They said many things about Sebastian Blackthorne, and most of them were true. But they had never seen him look at Princess Isolde Thorne of Valdemere on the night she was delivered to his London townhouse like a parcel settling a debt, her kingdom's financial ruin paid in full with the coin of her freedom. They had never seen the flicker of something almost human cross his face when she lifted her chin, met his frozen gaze with eyes like summer storms, and said in a voice that did not tremble, "I hope you find me worth the price, Your Grace. My kingdom certainly did." If this story has already captured your heart, do me a kindness. Press that like button so more souls can find their way to tales like these. Subscribe and ring the bell, because I promise you what happens next will make you believe in the transforming power of love. And if you've ever felt like a transaction rather than a treasure, stay with me. This one's for you. The rain fell on London like a curtain of silver grief, turning the cobblestones to mirrors that reflected a city indifferent to suffering. Princess Isolde Thorne stood in the entrance hall of Thornfield House and felt the weight of her new reality settle upon her shoulders like a cloak woven from shame and necessity. Behind her, the grand doors closed with a finality that echoed through the cavernous space, sealing her inside this monument to wealth and isolation. The Duke had not yet appeared. She had been standing here for 20 minutes, surrounded by servants who would not meet her eyes, her traveling cloak dripping rainwater onto marble floors that probably cost more than her kingdom's annual revenue. The irony was not lost on her. Valdemere had sold its princess to pay debts it could not honor, and now she stood in the home of the man who had purchased her as casually as one might purchase a thoroughbred mare. The paintings that lined the walls depicted stern-faced ancestors, all of them watching her with expressions of cold judgment. She wondered if they approved of their descendants' latest acquisition, a princess for £200,000, surely a bargain considering she came with royal blood and diplomatic connections, even if those connections were now worth less than the paper they were written upon. Isolde's hands trembled. She clasped them together, forcing stillness into her limbs through sheer will. She would not give this duke the satisfaction of seeing her break, not on the first night, perhaps not ever. She had left behind everything, her mother's grave, her father's failing health, her younger sister's tears, to become a payment, a settlement, a thing of transaction. But she was still a princess. She would remember that, even if no one else did. Sebastian Blackthorne descended the main staircase with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that power was often expressed through silence and perfect control. He had been watching her from the gallery above for the past 15 minutes, studying this woman who had cost him a fortune and would likely cost him far more before this arrangement reached its inevitable conclusion. She was not what he had expected. The reports had described her as beautiful, accomplished, bred for diplomacy and advantageous marriage.
They had not mentioned the steel in her spine, visible even from a distance, or the way she held herself like a soldier preparing for battle rather than a bride arriving at her new home. Her gown, he noted, was well made but outdated by at least 2 seasons. The cloak was good wool but showed signs of careful mending at the hem. Valdemir's poverty had not been exaggerated. He reached the bottom of the stairs, and her head turned. Their eyes met, and Sebastian felt something he had not experienced in 8 years, a flicker of genuine interest, quickly suppressed beneath the ice he wore like armor. She was beautiful, but London was full of beautiful women. What arrested him was the absolute lack of fear in her expression. She looked at him the way a general might assess an opposing commander, with calculation, respect for his power, but no cowering, no simpering plea for mercy. "Your Grace." Her voice was low, melodious with the slight accent that marked her for foreign. She curtsied with perfect precision, neither too deep nor too shallow. A curtsy that acknowledged his rank without surrendering her own dignity. "Princess Isolde." He did not bow. He never bowed, not even to royalty that came as purchased goods. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only with the sound of rain against windows and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the vast house. Sebastian studied her with the same cold assessment he would give to a contract requiring his signature. She bore the scrutiny without flinching, her storm-gray eyes meeting his without wavering. "I trust your journey was not too arduous," he said finally, the words precise and empty of genuine concern. "No more arduous than selling oneself to a stranger," Isolde replied, her tone matching his for coolness. "Though I confess the rain made for a rather fitting atmosphere, very gothic, very tragic. I half expected to see ghosts in the windows." Sebastian's eyebrow rose fractionally. Sarcasm. He had not anticipated sarcasm. "This house has no ghosts, Princess, only the living, and we are burden enough." "How disappointing. I was hoping for more interesting company than my own thoughts." A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only indication that her words had landed. He gestured toward the drawing room, where a fire had been lit against the evening's chill. "We should discuss the terms of our arrangement." "How romantic," Isolde murmured, but she moved toward the indicated door with grace that spoke of years of courtly training. Her wet cloak left a trail of dark spots on the pristine floor, and she seemed to take a small defiant pleasure in the minor destruction. The drawing room was appointed in shades of deep burgundy and forest green, masculine and austere. Sebastian closed the door behind them, noting how she positioned herself near the fire, seeking warmth but maintaining a clear path to the exit. Intelligent, cautious, good. "You will have the east wing for your private apartments," Sebastian began, his voice devoid of inflection as he moved to the sideboard and poured himself a brandy. He did not offer her one. "Your household staff will consist of a lady's maid, 2 housemaids, and a footman for errands. You will receive an allowance of £500 per quarter for personal expenses, clothing, and incidentals." Isolde listened, her face carefully blank, her hands folded before her like a schoolgirl receiving instruction. Inside, rage and humiliation warred with pragmatic acceptance. £500 per quarter. Her father had sold her for £200,000, and this was her portion, a mere fraction, paid out like wages to a governess. "You will accompany me to social functions as required," the Duke continued, swirling the brandy in his glass, but not drinking. "You will comport yourself with appropriate dignity. You will not discuss the financial arrangements that brought you here, nor will you cast aspersions on my character or conduct to members of the ton.
In return, you will be treated with the respect due your rank and provided with every material comfort." "How generous," Isolde said, and this time her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "And what of my comfort, your grace? What of my wishes, my preferences, my autonomy as a human being rather than a particularly expensive acquisition?" Sebastian's frozen eyes met hers. "You surrendered those considerations when your father signed the contract." The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Isolde felt them like a physical blow, but she would not, could not, show weakness now. "I see. And are there other terms you wish to dictate? Perhaps you have opinions on what I should read, what I should think, how I should breathe." "Your sarcasm is noted, Princess, but ultimately futile." Sebastian set down his glass with deliberate care, the crystal meeting mahogany with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gavel pronouncing judgment.
"I did not create the circumstances that brought you here. I merely provided a solution to your kingdom's insolvency. If you find the terms distasteful, I suggest you direct your resentment toward the man who gambled away your country's treasury." Isolde's composure cracked. She took 3 steps forward, closing the distance between them with a swiftness that made Sebastian's hand move instinctively toward nothing. He wore no weapon in his own home, but the defensive instinct remained, a remnant from years when trust had been a luxury he could not afford. "Do not," Isolde said, her voice low and vibrating with fury, "speak of my father. You know nothing of the impossible choices he faced, the pressures that drove him to desperation. You sit here in your palace of marble and judgment, dispensing pronouncements about dignity and respect, but you are nothing more than a wealthy predator who saw an opportunity to add a princess to your collection of expensive things. Do not pretend this is charity, your grace. We both know exactly what this is." The fire crackled in the hearth. Rain lashed the windows, and Sebastian Blackthorne stared at this woman who dared to speak to him with such naked honesty, such fearless rage, and felt something crack in the frozen wasteland of his chest. Just a hairline fracture, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. "You are right," he said quietly, and watched shock replace anger in her eyes. "This is not charity. This is business. But I am not your enemy, Princess Isolde." "Then what are you, your grace?" "I am the man who will keep you safe." The words settled between them like snow falling on frozen ground, soft, unexpected, transformative. Isolde stared at the Duke, searching his face for mockery or manipulation, but found only a weary sincerity that seemed at odds with everything she had heard about the Iron Duke. "Safe," she repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. "Safe from what, precisely? I am already trapped in a gilded cage of your making." Sebastian moved toward the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. "Safe from the alternatives that would have befallen you had I not intervened. Your kingdom's creditors were not all gentlemen, Princess. Some would have demanded payment in forms far less civilized than this arrangement. Some would have seen your beauty as an asset to be exploited in ways that would have destroyed you utterly." The truth of his words struck her like a blow. She had known, of course. Her father's ministers had spoken in euphemisms and careful phrases, but she had understood what awaited Valdemir's princess if the debts remained unpaid. There were brothels in Paris that catered to men who enjoyed the degradation of nobility. There were private collectors where beautiful women disappeared into lives of captivity and unspeakable use. "So I should be grateful?" Isolde's voice wavered despite her effort to control it. "Grateful that you purchased me before someone else could do worse?" "No." Sebastian turned to face her, and something in his expression had softened imperceptibly. "But you should understand that while you are here, under my protection, no harm will come to you. That is not a term of our arrangement, Princess. That is a vow."
The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Isolde felt tears threatening despite her determination not to show such weakness. Sebastian watched the princess struggle against tears with something approaching admiration. She stood straighter, lifted her chin, and forced the moisture from her eyes through sheer force of will. It was a display of strength he recognized because he had perfected the same technique himself years ago, when weakness had been a luxury that invited destruction. "Your apartments have been prepared," he said, his voice gentling fractionally. "Mrs. Hartwell, my housekeeper, will show you upstairs. Your belongings from Valdemir will arrive tomorrow. Tonight, necessities have been provided: nightclothes, toiletries, everything you might require for comfort." How thoughtful! The sarcasm had returned, but weaker now, a shield she wielded from habit rather than genuine defense. "And where are your apartments situated, Your Grace? I should know how far I must flee should you decide to exercise other rights you believe you've purchased." The accusation hung between them, ugly and raw. Sebastian felt anger flare, not at her implication, but at the world that had taught her to expect such violations as inevitable. "The master's chambers are in the west wing," he said, coldly, "opposite yours. And you need not fear unwanted intrusions, Princess. I have no intention of forcing myself upon you. When and if intimacy occurs between us, it will be by mutual consent, or it will not occur at all." Isolde's eyes widened. Whatever she had expected, it was not this. "You paid £200,000 for a wife you don't intend to touch?" "I paid £200,000 to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe and secure diplomatic advantages," Sebastian corrected. "Your body was never part of the transaction, despite what your father's contract may have implied. That is something you would give freely or not at all."
Sleep eluded Isolde that first night in Thornfield House. She lay in a bed so soft it felt like floating on clouds, surrounded by luxury that mocked her captivity and stared at the canopy above her head. The fabric was silk, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that caught the moonlight, filtering through heavy curtains. Everything in this room cost more than most of Valdemir's citizens would see in a lifetime. And yet, the Duke's words echoed in her mind, disrupting the simple narrative of villain and victim she had constructed to armor herself against this new reality. "No harm will come to you." He had spoken it like a sacred oath, with a gravity that suggested he understood precisely what harm looked like, had perhaps experienced it himself. She rose from the bed, wrapping herself in the dressing gown that had been laid out, silk again, the color of midnight, far finer than anything in her own wardrobe. The room was warm, a fire kept burning by unseen servants, but she felt cold from the inside out. The window drew her, and she pressed her palm against the glass, looking out over the darkened gardens below. London sprawled beyond the estate's walls, a city of millions, and she knew not a single soul within it, except the man who had purchased her freedom at the cost of her autonomy. The isolation was crushing, more complete than anything she had known in Valdemir's palace, where at least she had been surrounded by familiar faces and the comfort of her native tongue. A sound in the corridor outside made her turn. Footsteps, measured and deliberate, passing her door without pausing. The Duke, apparently as sleepless as she. For a moment, Isolde considered opening her door, calling out to him, but pride and uncertainty held her motionless behind her own threshold. The introduction to London society came 3 days later, at Lady Ashworth's ball, one of the season's most anticipated events, where the crème of the ton gathered to see and be seen, to judge and be judged, to sharpen their social knives on the reputations of anyone foolish enough to provide vulnerability. Isolde stood before the mirror in her apartments while her new lady's maid, a capable woman named Marie, arranged her hair in an elaborate style that seemed designed to add inches to her height and decades to her appearance. The gown was new, commissioned by the Duke without consulting her preferences,
deep sapphire silk that brought out the stormy gray of her eyes, cut in the latest fashion with a neckline that was modest by London standards but felt scandalously low to someone raised in Valdemir's conservative court. "You look beautiful, Your Highness," Marie murmured, securing a final pin adorned with diamonds that were certainly real. Everything in this house was real, genuine, expensive. Nothing false was permitted in the Iron Duke's domain. "I look like an ornament," Isolde replied, studying her reflection with critical detachment. "Something decorative and expensive, designed to reflect well on its owner." Marie's hand stilled. "His Grace has been quite generous with the wardrobe budget, ma'am. He wants you to shine." "His Grace wants me to be presentable." Isolde softened her tone, recognizing that her bitterness was not Marie's fault. "I apologize. You've done beautiful work. I'm simply not accustomed to being displayed like a prize mare at auction." The carriage ride to Lady Ashworth's townhouse was conducted in silence. Sebastian sat across from her, impeccable in black evening dress, his expression giving away nothing. But Isolde noticed how his eyes kept returning to her, assessing, calculating something she could not quite read. The ballroom blazed with light from 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in gilded mirrors that made the space seem infinite. Music swirled through air heavy with perfume, champagne, and the particular tension that came from gathering hundreds of ambitious people in one space and watching them compete for social supremacy. Every eye turned when Sebastian Blackthorne entered with his foreign princess on his arm. The whispers began immediately, a susurration of silk and scandal that followed them like a wave. "That's her, the one he purchased to settle Valdemir's debts. £200,000, I heard. Imagine being sold like cattle." "Pretty enough, I suppose, but there's something desperate about her. You can always tell when someone comes from poverty." "They say her father gambled away an entire kingdom. What kind of bloodline produces such weakness?" Isolde heard every word. They were meant to be heard, pitched just loud enough to carry, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. She kept her expression serene, her hand light on Sebastian's arm, and cursed the trembling that threatened to betray her composure. Sebastian felt it, the slight tremor where her gloved fingers rested against his sleeve. He glanced down at her face, saw the careful blankness there, and recognized it for what it was, the same mask he wore every day, the same armor against a world that took pleasure in inflicting pain. "Ignore them," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Rather difficult when they're speaking loud enough to ensure I cannot. They're vicious because they're bored. You're new, foreign, and attached to me. That makes you irresistible prey." How comforting! They had barely progressed 10 feet into the ballroom when Lady Ashworth herself materialized before them, a formidable woman in her 60s whose opinion could make or break a reputation within the span of a single ball. If this story is touching something deep within your heart, please subscribe and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It amazes me to know how far my stories travel.